Hello everyone, I hope you're all doing great today and I hope you all enjoyed these stories. For early access to my videos, make sure you check out my Patreon and make sure you check out my podcast too, which is in the description below, where you can also listen to all of my stories there. I have a quick message before the video starts, so today I'd like to share this. I think that if you're having bad days and if you're just really feeling not great in yourself, and even if you're doing the things that are right to make you feel better and not feeling any different, it's okay to accept that you're going to have bad days where you just don't feel right. And sometimes it's just the case. Like, even for myself, sometimes I can do everything that should make me feel better and it doesn't make too much of a difference. But I think in these cases, it's important to just go easy on yourself and accept that you're not always going to have great days where you feel amazing or even good sometimes. So you just need to accept it and understand that it will pass and get through it, because brighter days will come after that, I promise. And they will. So just as a thought there, so try not to get too caught up in it and just try and see past it. I think that's the most important thing with it. So yes, I hope everybody's doing great and take care. I'll speak to you all soon. Now, this happened to my buddy and me when I was in college during the winter of 2010. I was and still am an outdoorsy guy who had been at home in the woods for a very long time. So yeah, I've seen a lot and I've really heard a lot, but this experience is not as I expected it to be. I met my buddy at college during that first semester and we become friends fast. Before I knew it, he was inviting me back to his family's place that winter to stay there and do a bit of hog hunting. I have hunted hogs since I was old enough to hunt, so jump at the chance. We get to his parents' place and my god, it was beautiful. They own 1,500 acres out in rural West Texas. His family raise, show and sell cattle and are loaded. They're amazing people and kind of took me on like a second son. Over my time at college, I was visiting them a lot, but since this is his family and they're avid hunters, and the land they live on is mainly for cattle, they actually have another 1,000 acres that they lease to hunters to use. So after a day or two at the primary ranch, we set out to the hunting lease. It was my buddy, myself, and no other hunters had the lease there that winter. We had set up stuff at the little hunting cabin that they had and set alarms to wake up at 6 a.m. We got some rest and woke up and get ready to go out to the stand. Us being college kids, we brought whiskey and coke and our rifles. Now, spare me the lectures, we were stupid college kids. We got to the stand and after a short hike through the cold, we hopped up into it. It was one of those big green metal stands that's elevated about 20 feet in the air. The area that we're set up in is basically perfect. Now, to the left about 100 yards away, it was a mostly rock clearing with trees lining it and dead cactus. In front of us was a wider clearing with sparse trees and various weeds and grass. To the right was a decently dense patch of trees, and behind us was a dense patch of forest and a high fence about 30 yards back. We could not see behind us because the blind had only about a 180-degree view. Just a back wall at the door and a window that was boarded up because a glass had been broken or whatever. We just sat up in the chairs and started drinking and wait. We had a beautiful view of the area and the sunrise was coming from the east. We didn't see anything at first for the first hour, so we just kept drinking and chatting. About an hour after the sun rose, we started hearing some limbs breaking through the brush, rustling behind us. Sounded a good ways back, maybe 50 yards or more, and we ready our rifles hoping that the hogs are there. I remembered sitting there just waiting, watching the fog from my breath for a good 5 minutes. Now the rustling sound suddenly gets closer. I then noticed a metallic smell. The best way I can describe it was the smell of capitals given off when you don't take care of them. Kind of like a mix of copper vomit and feces or something. Not nice. I looked at my buddy and whispered, "You smell that?" And he nodded and shrugs his shoulders. A minute later we're still waiting, and the rustling seems to get closer. Then it kinda stopped. After a couple of minutes, I could still make out the smell but no noise, and figured maybe a couple of hogs had been there and moved on. I reached to pick up the bottle as my buddy puts his rifle down, and just as we're doing that, we heard a scream sound. It's not like anything I've ever heard before. It was a low grunt that escalated into a gravelly scream. Now it sounds as though it's right outside the back of the blind. Now, before we could really react, we heard a bunch of twigs and branches snap. It sounded like it was right outside the back of the blind. Not a couple of seconds after, we feel the entire blind shake about 3 times as though a car shook into it. I dropped the bottle of whiskey and just looked at my friend, and he looks at me just as scared. We hear a loud singular grunt and then the sounds of twigs and branches again, slowly getting quieter and quieter. We just sit there freaked out, too scared to move, for what felt like an hour, but it was probably only about 10 minutes. I don't know if it was the whiskey or just me trying to be brave, but I got up and opened the door, and nothing's there. We climbed down and had our rifles ready. We both knew it wasn't a hog, but tried to convince ourselves it was. We could see the old stand marks on the ground, and the whole stand had been rocked about 6 inches. There was a bent proportion on one of the metal strodes, and 2 big depressions where it looked as though feet had dug into the rocky ground. We figured whatever it was stood there, and was standing next to the rocks. We stood there dumbfounded, and we decided to get out of there. We drove back to his house and told his dad. He said just to stay at their house with them that night, and they're going to go and check it out tomorrow. When we got there the day after, we saw the same things that we had seen the day prior. Now his dad is really super confused. I don't believe he initially believed us when we told him exactly what had happened. We found out exactly where it had come from. There was a clear patch in the grass leading away from the stand where it had been depressed, and you could see tree limbs broken. The highest one was about 7 feet off the ground. So we walked back 30 yards to the higher fence that was there, and sure enough, about a 4-foot wide section had been mangled and bent down. The dad was annoyed obviously, but massively confused. He told us that he never had this happen before and reckons it was just a giant hog, but I don't think so. I don't want to say it was Bigfoot, but I never had a real explanation as to what could have caused it. Over the years I've grown to believe in Bigfoot more and more, and my dad had an encounter which he claims was Bigfoot, so maybe it runs in the family, but I don't know. This happened when I was younger, around 8 or 9. I grew up on a reservation in eastern Maine. I lived there with my mother and brother who was younger. We lived in a 2-story multi-dwelling unit or public house in a vast wooded area in my backyard, surrounded by deep woods, and it wouldn't take much to get lost out there. But I always enjoyed adventuring and was very familiar with the territory. It was late winter, about 4 to 5 inches of snow on the ground. I heard knocking on the front and back door at the same time, around 1 AM in the morning. I noticed it first, and then my mother got up and told my brother and I to stay in the room. She calls the police and went downstairs to see if somebody's at the door. We kept hearing knocking, but as my mother got closer to the door, it suddenly stopped. No one could visibly see anything outside to make this, and the police finally showed up. They lit up the place. The neighbours came out to see what was going on, as we had 5 neighbours in our MDU. All of them said that they didn't see or hear anyone. Police search around the property and see if anybody ran off into the forest, but they don't find anything. A cruiser stayed in our parking lot for the majority of the night, just in case anything happened again. Sunrise came up and the officer left early in the morning. My mother and next door neighbour then went outside, and I assume it's to talk about what happened. Then she noticed in the snow a footprints that went alongside the building, leading all the way back to the forest. But these footprints were strange. It's almost as though somebody was wearing pointed men's boots between size 10 and 12. The prints were inadvertently facing inwards, kind of weird, not like you could walk in a straight line. The creepiest part about them is that the steps move side to side. Toes are inverted, looking as though they jumped like some kind of creature would, but perfectly straight until getting into the woods. My mother didn't say anything about them till later on when I was older, because she knew obviously I would be freaked out. But it was really weird to see. I assumed the footprints were maybe made partly by the officers, but these looked too normal, and I don't know why the officers would have went there. Now I followed the prints into the woods, and no other markings around them perfectly inverted hops or steps, leading deeper and deeper into the forest. It got to the point where an uneasy feeling crept over me, like something was telling me to go back. But I knew where the prints were leading, and I was pretty familiar with the area. I eventually get to a marsh or bog area. I get chilled out by that, and thought that I need to turn back now. I never said anything to my mum about it. Now, I never encountered anything similar since, but I don't really know what to make of it. Now, I'm somebody who lives in Maine. On Thanksgiving of 2019, me, my mother, and two aunts went on a walk around my neighbourhood after the meal to help digest the food a bit. I should also note that the houses in my neighbourhood are all spaced apart pretty well by the woods. Now, a few minutes into walking I get tired, so I turned to go back home while they kept moving some more, and on my way home, I was walking down by a street that didn't have many houses on it. I start to hear my mum calling my name through the woods, except her voice was somewhat off, kind of like it was ever more slightly slowed down to compare to her normal voice. I yell, "Mum." Once I don't hear anything back other than the voice telling me to come towards her, I was a little spooked, but I had also told her that I was tired, so I kept on my way home. When she and my aunts got back from their walks, I asked her what she wanted. To this day, she claims that she never called my name and never went near the woods. I did some research online and found out that skinwalkers apparently have the ability to mimic voices of loved ones in an attempt to lure you in, but I don't really know what to think of it. Now, this encounter happened about 2 years ago in Oregon. Now, the previous encounter I had was 8 years ago in Oregon too. It was my birthday in April, and we took a trip deep into the woods, hiking and camping, as this is my favourite thing to do. I also remembered this incident well, as it was the time that my wisdom tooth was flaring up and I was in pain. Not excruciatingly so, but relatively annoying. We had spent the day driving around the woods and hiking, and when nightfall had started to set in, it had rained all day, and sometimes it was hard to make out things through the mist. But as the sun started to set, you could tell that there was a nasty spring storm rolling in. We drove up a remote forest that hadn't been maintained in what seems like years. The trees had grown into the road and scraped against the vehicle, but we like camping off the beaten path to avoid humans. Now, we had come to an area where the road widened on the top and was surrounded by a second growth forest and some scattered old growth trees. We stopped the car and prepared the car for sleeping. I don't sleep in the tent anymore, and I flat out refused to. Now, we had sat in the car listening to the wind pick up, and it was going to be a nasty, nasty storm. The trees were rocking, and it was a bit unnerving. Being on a high point on the terrain made the wind a bit worse. We had the windows down, and there was some more wind and rain, and only a drizzle. That night wasn't particularly cold, so it was comfortable to have the windows down. That's when I started hearing noises. Every so often, I'd hear what sounded like men talking in the woods. You could hear it more clear from my side of the car when the wind chimed down and between the gusts. You could hear it when the wind picks up. though more drowned out. I could tell that whatever it was making these sounds was way off in the distance. You can make out everything they were saying, and it sounded like they're having a very continuous conversation, as though there were no breaks in the noise. My roommate was talking, and I asked him to stop for a moment to listen. Then, we heard the voices and don't know what to make of it. Then things got ugly. At last my fear level shot up. We started to hear what sounded like even a baby crying in the distance, on my roommate's side of the car now. That for some reason made me absolutely nauseous. It's the middle of nowhere, pitch black out, and all of the noises that we hear are not your typical crickets, and they're louder than the wind of the storm somehow. As these noises seemed to get louder and closer, we decided we had enough and drove in the direction of leaving this forest road. We got about 2 miles down the road, and it intersects with a more maintained area of the forest and a better road, and we stopped there to organise all the stuff, as we'd gotten comfortable, leaving blankets on us and food out. We sat there organising when we heard the sound of people talking again, at a distance. They all stopped together, and we sat there in silence for about 15 minutes, and you could hear something running around the road from behind the car. It ran right up on the car faster than anything I've ever seen. It looked like it floated, and this huge black mass comes right up over the driver's side window. That's when my roommate floors it. I couldn't see any detail of the creature as it was pitch black outside, but it was extremely large and dark. The mass was like an upright cow running to your car. We ended up getting to the main highway and drove half an hour down the road, and then camped in another location. By then we were exhausted. Nothing happened at the other location, but we're constantly on edge. It's a birthday that I'll never forget. Now I still hike deep into the wilderness, but I always have some kind of protection with me. Even then I feel intimidated. Now this encounter happened about 2 years ago in Oregon. Now the previous encounter I had was 8 years ago in Oregon too. It was my birthday in April, and we took a trip deep into the woods, hiking and camping, as this is my favourite thing to do. I also remembered this incident well, as it was a time that my wisdom tooth was flaring up and I was in pain. Not excruciatingly so, but relatively annoying. We had spent the day driving around the woods and hiking, and when nightfall had started to set in, it had rained all day, and sometimes it was hard to make out things through the mist. But as the sun started to set, you could tell that there was a nasty spring storm rolling in. We drove up a remote forest that hadn't been maintained in what seems like years. The trees had grown into the road and scraped against the vehicle, but we like camping off the beaten path to avoid humans. Now, we had come to an area where the road widened on the top and was surrounded by a second growth forest and some scattered old growth trees. We stopped the car and prepared the car for sleeping. I don't sleep in the tent anymore, and I flat out refused to. Now we had sat in the car listening to the wind pick up, and it was going to be a nasty storm. The trees were rocking and it was a bit unnerving. Being on a high point on the terrain made the wind a bit worse. We had the windows down, and there was some more wind and rain and only a drizzle. That night wasn't particularly cold, so it was comfortable to have the windows down. That's when I started hearing noises. Every so often, I'd hear what sounded like men talking in the woods. You could hear it more clear from my side of the car when the wind chimed down and between the gusts. You could hear it when the wind picks up, though more drowned out. I could tell that whatever it was making these sounds was way off in the distance. You can make out everything they were saying, and it sounded like they're having a very continuous conversation, as though there were no breaks in the noise. My roommate was talking, and I asked him to stop for a moment to listen. Then, we heard the voices and don't know what to make of it. Then things got ugly. At last my fear level shot up. We started to hear what sounded like even a baby crying in the distance, on my roommate's side of the car now. That for some reason made me absolutely nauseous. It's the middle of nowhere, pitch black out, and all of the noises that we hear are not your typical crickets, and they're louder than the wind of the storm somehow. As these noises seemed to get louder and closer, we decided we had enough and drove in the direction of leaving this forest road. We got about 2 miles down the road, and it intersects with a more maintained area of the forest and a better road, and we stopped there to organise all the stuff, as we'd gotten comfortable leaving blankets on us and food out. We sat there organising when we heard the sound of people talking again at a distance. They all stopped together, and we sat there in silence for about 15 minutes, and you could hear something running around the road from behind the car. It ran right up on the car faster than anything I've ever seen. It looked like it floated, and this huge black mass comes right up over the driver's side window. That's when my roommate floors it. I couldn't see any detail of the creature as it was pitch black outside, but it was extremely large and dark. The mass was like an upright cow running to your car. We ended up getting to the main highway and drove half an hour down the right road and then camped in another location. By then we were exhausted. Nothing happened at the other location, but we're constantly on edge. It's a birthday that I'll never forget. Now I still hike deep into the wilderness, but I always have some kind of protection with me. Even then I feel intimidated. Now we're on our way to our aunt's house because she needed help mounting her new TV. So, on the way from the store there, we stopped over at our aunt's place, helped her and went on about our business. Our aunt lives in this neighbourhood that's out in the country, so there's nothing but miles and miles of trees with a few houses in between. Mum was the one that was driving, and we both see this tall, lanky-bodied white creature with like the face of a deer, but we know it's not a deer. My mum started speeding as fast as she can away from this, which makes it even scarier that there's no other cars around. Now for a while, we didn't say anything to each other and finally say, "Did you see that thing run across the road?" I told her I did, and we go into silence. Today she brought it up again and thinks it might be a skinwalker, to which I agreed. I think it probably was. Now, I'd like to follow up from this, and here's an update. I'm a cat mum. I love cats. Now, I have 3 inside cats and a few stray cats that had taken up residency in our yard. They guard this yard with their whole life come hell or high water. My boy cat that's typically back and forth outside, Orion, went outside yesterday morning because he'd been chilling with this female cat, Seba. She's an outside cat. So I was cooking earlier and had a small piece of steak left over. I usually mince it to give it to the other cats, but Orion hadn't come inside. Mum's in the living room watching TV, so I go outside to call for him, and I don't see him. I assume that he's outside chilling, and I go back inside. We wait a few hours and I go back outside to see if he's out there, but he's not. Now since my neighbours are outside, I decide to head out to see if he is underneath this fan. We believe that he could be. Now, I don't give the chance to that though, because as I'm calling his name, I hear something that sounded like a wounded cat. I immediately think it's mine and start calling his name, but the cat keeps responding. But the meow isn't normal and I can tell something's off. My mum came outside to check on me and just completely stops. Me and her both call for this cat, but it's not responding anymore, almost as though it's watching and observing. It sent chills down my spine. Honestly, I wasn't scared or sensing anything malicious, but I could tell something was watching the both of us. Now I took time to go check under the van, but the cat's not there. He hasn't moved since earlier that day when he was under there staring at this area of trees around our home. I call his name and his ear folds back a little and he adjusts around, but still staring at this woodland area. The other two cats are laying out in the yard. I shake a small bag of cat food to try and lure Orion out so I can bring him inside, but he doesn't budge. He's just staring at the trees. Now, I decide to head back in at this time, and I get this sense that I'm definitely being watched now, and the other cats are now all underneath the van staring at the trees. Now, this is weird to me, and I don't know what's going on, but I do not want to see this thing up close and personal. Now, as an update 1, I heard tapping at my room window and hear heavy wheezing. We're the only occupied house in this stretch of road aside from the people that live up the road from us. Our neighbours are currently renovating their home, so haven't been staying there physically for months. Currently sleeping with an axe near my bed, my mum is refusing to sleep in her bedroom and is now sleeping on the couch. Now, my younger brother said he heard somebody knocking on his window or something when he was trying to fall asleep. Now manages to bring Orion in early this morning because he was waiting at the screen porch with his eyes wide, ears folded back and meowing as though he's scared, and he's still staring in that direction to the woods. Now we also have some labs. They're all barking together at something for about an hour. That's some weird stuff. I've dealt with paranormal stuff before, but never like this. If somebody has any suggestions as to how we can protect ourselves, I'd like them. Now, I live in Maine. On Thanksgiving of 2019, me, my mother and 2 aunts went on a walk around my neighbourhood after the meal to help digest the food a little. I should also note that the houses in the neighbourhood are all spaced apart pretty well by the woods. A few minutes into the walk and I get pretty tired, so I turned to go back home while they kept walking some more. On my way home, I was walking down a street that didn't have any houses on it, and I started to hear my mother calling my name through the woods, except her voice is somewhat off, kind of like it was ever so more slightly slowed down compared to normal. I yelled "Mum" once, didn't hear anything back, other than a voice telling me to come towards her. I was a little spooked, but I also had told her I was tired, so kept on my way home. When she and my aunts got back from their walk, I asked her what she wanted, and to this day, she claims that she never called my name and never went near the woods. I did some research online and found out that apparently Wendigos have the ability to mimic the voices of loved ones to try and get them in. No one would ever believe me, but I wanted to share this story because I talked about it for the first time yesterday. Back when I was 16, I was walking in a heavily wooded area near St. Louis, Missouri, a largely underdeveloped plot of land that was known for a large population of deer. The snow and ice had been unusually heavy that winter, so after April came around, it continued to fall and rain a lot. Very dreary, overcast day. There's lots of fallen trees and mud, and I noticed one tree had fallen in the middle of the path, and I didn't focus too much on it until I saw something dangling inches from my face. It was a dead deer, a young buck hanging from the fallen tree in between 2 main branches. The hoofs had been dangling inches from my face because of how zoned out I was, so I wasn't really processing anything because of the sense of security I felt in the woods. This was private property owned by the school I was attending, and hunting was strictly prohibited. There were neighborhoods nearby. More importantly, who would have walked hundreds of acres into the woods and hung up such a carcass in that way in the middle of a rainstorm too? School sent out its security, and they probably thought it was illegal bow hunting, but the deer was never recovered, so at first they didn't believe my story until weeks later when several female deer were found laying in a nearby open field, all sprawled out in weird poses which were clearly manipulated after death. No signs of post-mortem cuts or anything, which is really weird from animals. Obviously something weird was going on here, and I don't want to say it was paranormal, but I don't know what it could have been. My boyfriend Jason and I went on a month-long camping trip to multiple states. Everything had been going really well until October 9th. We decided to ditch a campground reservation and randomly pitch our tent near Alberson Basin within the Utah Mountains, Alta, Utah, not far off the Surrey Lake trailhead. We parked our car at around 3 p.m. at the Alberson Basin campground, closed for season. Admittedly, it was a little tense because this is our first dispersed camping attempt and we had no proper backpacking gear. Upon arrival, we realised the area we wanted to pitch our tent was about 2 miles uphill. At this point, we started to express regret as we planned camping in Nephi, Utah, that we decided to skip on a whim. Now, after grumping around for a bit and having a large lunch to avoid packing food, we packed our backpacks with the best gear we had to get through the night as it was going to be 25F. We set out up the trail, seeing the occasional family or couple heading down the mountain. As we trudged on, we both start to feel strange. It's almost as though that we're being followed almost, but not really. And we start thinking that we probably should have just gotten a hotel instead of trying to backpack for the night. We both felt like we had something to prove, so continue. Fast forward and we make it up to the Crook Lake, totally empty, so nothing like the pictures. Disappointing and eerie. Whatever. We keep on hiking up, and in an attempt to find seclusion and flat land, we stumble across a decent space. I see a small cave in the distance, and I point it out to my boyfriend to deliberate if it's a hell no kind of situation. But after he checks it out, he says it seems like a normal animal crawl space, which is no biggie, and we set up as night fell quickly. We play some cards and bundle up, and decide to go to bed early around 8:30, as we plan to leave ASAP in the morning, maybe around 5 a.m. We both slowly dwindle, and after what feels like 30 minutes, I woke up abruptly at 11:24 p.m. I woke up with a feeling that I've never experienced before. I woke up wide awake, scared but unprovoked, and it was as though there was no way in hell that I was going to fall asleep again, when I was always asleep through the night usually. My boyfriend was asleep, so I let him just be and lie there and try and listen to whatever it is out there. Around 12 a.m, my boyfriend woke up stirring, much to my delight as I did not want to feel alone anymore. I told him I could not sleep, but he suggested I rest my eyes as we were leaving early in the morning. I agreed, literally not wanting to be a baby. I say I'm very scared. Now this is really short-lived as my boyfriend couldn't fall asleep himself, so we ended up laying there together trying to sleep when I ended up blurting out I was scared. We agreed it was fine for us just to stick it through the night as it was now approaching 2:30 a.m. and we had a small axe and a pellet gun for protection, so I didn't need to be frightened. Not even 5 minutes later, we were still wide awake and my boyfriend's head perks up so fast that my heart nearly jumps out of my head. "What is it?" he replied. "Listen." And I'm not joking, we hear the sound of gravelly crunching under boots as though somebody walked straight up to our tent, stopped, then goes over to the side of the tent, probably looking for the door. I felt the blood drain out of my face immediately. In real time, this all occurred no more than 10 seconds, but my mind flashed a million thoughts a second. I was convinced it was a ranger coming to tell us that we can't camp there, so I called out hello, my brain entirely sure that I heard human footsteps. Within 2 to 3 seconds of hearing footsteps, my boyfriend grabs a gun and burst out of the tent for any chance to confront this person, as I knew he heard exactly the same thing. But there's nothing. There was nothing there. Now as soon as my boyfriend makes it out of the tent, I quickly go after him. Now we both clearly heard something, so walk up but can't find anything. We hardly exchanged words and packed up our stuff, looking over our shoulders terrified, and booked it down the mountain with only moonlight guiding us, too scared to turn on our flashlights. It's really the worst 20 or so minutes of my life, and I'm really expecting someone to appear following us. We made it to our car and we locked the doors and start out of there really quickly, completely speechless. And at this point it's about 3:30 and we eventually make it into town, sleeping in a parking lot of a grocery store. We have obviously since discussed what happened and we're both haunted by the footsteps, and we didn't really get answers to what specifically happened to us that night. This happened to one of my friends. He and two buddies decided to go camping one weekend in Uinta Mountains, UT. They wanted to go out in the middle of nowhere to really get away from civilization and just chill and fish and stuff like that. All three of them are pretty outdoorsy and experienced with camping and backpacking, so this was no big deal for them. They went to the trailhead inn and hiked about 1.5 miles up the trail, and then turned off the trail and just hiked for another 4 miles away from the trail. They had little trail markers so they wouldn't find their way back if they got lost. They eventually find a spot though, and there is no sign of anybody around. The grounds look untouched by humans. There was also a brook close by, so they decided to set up camp. All three of them had camping hammocks, so they set those up in the trees and then just kind of explored around for a bit before deciding to build a fire and eat and stuff like that. Eventually, the evening rolled around, so they built a fire and made tinfoil dinners, and they're just basically talking when they decide to go to bed. The guy who told me this said that he remembered laying in his sleeping bag in his hammock thinking that even though there was the sound of water in the brook close by, every now and then there'd be like an insect noise or something, and suddenly it would go quiet. Like, being out of civilization made him realize how rarely we as humans experience real silence, as often there's so many noises filling our days. He says it felt eerie. He could feel himself starting to doze off when the worst thing in the world happened to him. He had to go and pee, despite already being comfy and warm. He figured he'd rip the band-aid off and go pee before he fell asleep for the night. He put on his headlamp and got out of his hammock and walked about 30 feet away from the other buddies. When he was walking over, he thought that he saw something dart out of sight unnaturally fast and heard a crack of a branch. But then, they were so far out in the middle of nowhere he didn't really think too much of it, so goes to pee. And then, as he turns round with his headlamp, it shines on something, unmistakably. Fresh human footprints on the ground. It had rained in the mountains the day before, so the earth was soft in some areas, and there was no doubt in his mind that these were not only human footprints, but whoever made them were barefoot. The creepiest thing is that the footprints weren't staggered, they were in fact side by side, facing where these guys had been camping. It was though someone was just standing there, still at the edge of their camping spot in total darkness watching them. Those were the only footprints my friend could see, no other prints leading away or to where they were. Now they're totally freaked out. He ran back to the hammock, got his knife, and he loudly whispers two of his friends' names, but they're already asleep, so they don't answer. He debated whether or not he should wake them up, but decided against it because there was no real physical threat that he could think of that would justify waking them up. He put his headlamp on a brighter setting and shone it up there in the trees and generally around the area that he had urinated, but nothing. He didn't sleep that night. He laid in his hammock wide awake with the knife on his hand all night. Those footprints looked as though somebody had been standing there those moments that he had stopped to urinate, so he definitely wasn't alone. When it reaches early in the morning, the sun is up and my friend decides to go pack up all of his stuff. He was still spooked out and wanted to start hiking back to their car when his friends were up. When he walked down taking his hammock, he saw another set of footprints, and these are fresh, but this time like 10 feet away from the hammock. They clearly went over to where he was sleeping and just stood there, so he quickly wakes up the friends and they get out of there. Now this encounter is second hand, but was told to me on multiple occasions by the same person. I'm a natural skeptic, so I can't say I 100% believe it, but his telling of it is pretty simple yet concise and doesn't change at all during any retellings. I've known this guy for many years, and his advice and input on just about everything is well reasoned and always helpful, so I'll take his word on it, even if with a grain of salt. Now keep in mind that I'm not a seasoned writer, and my past tense may get a little jumbled up, but here we go. So let's get down to business. My friend, we'll call him Marv, likes to go solitary camping on occasion to be one with nature and things like that. He's also an avid gum collector and enthusiast. I don't remember exactly what he said, but he took this place a few years back and decided to go camping on a whim. He packs his gear, a few guns, hunting rifle and .45, sidearm specifically. He then heads out into the country onto a vast swatch of property owned by a friend of his. Now he had full permission to be there. Now this happened close to a national forest in south/central Louisiana. I won't be any more specific than that, but it's safe to say that it's miles and miles of forest and wilderness. We had to hike in there pretty deep and camp at a specific spot he found a few trips prior. These details are kind of sparse, as it's not really the meat and potatoes of this encounter. I love that saying. So he made his way in and set up camp in the usual small clearing for the night, skipping ahead a few hours as it was late afternoon now, when he heard leaves crunching and twigs being stepped on. He assumed it was an animal at first and got up from cooking something on the fire to try and get a look. He gazed in the direction of the noise and saw a man approaching through the trees a good few yards away. He described his etiquette for dealing with other people in very remote places as to always be cautious, as more often than not he comes across people armed like him. He tries to stay as friendly as possible, but still keeps his guard up, looking for any ulterior motives, as you can never tell when some folks are up to no good out in the middle of nowhere. So he makes some chit chat with them and just basically sees what they're up to. Now he's never really met anybody out of the ordinary who seems like they're up to anything malevolent so far. So one thing that sets off small alarm bells for him is that he knows he's the only one with permission to be on the property, and second, this guy is not dressed for the location at all. He said the guy was wearing a white t-shirt, some blue jogger shorts and white socks and sneakers. Mind you, Marv is miles out in the middle of the woods away from any paths, roadways, houses or anything really. Nobody is going to casually stroll into his current location dressed like that unless they're confused, lost or else. It was early fall but not quite cool, so there's a ton of mosquitoes, ticks and other insects aplenty. You're not going to have most of your skin exposed if you can help it in the woods. I know that all too well from my own experience. So Marv assumes something might be up and calls out, "Hey, do you need help or something?" pretty loud. Definitely loud enough to be heard. The guy keeps walking forward, staring directly at him. Now at this point, Marv is starting to get unnerved, and as I said, I know the guy too well and he's cool as a cucumber in a tense situation. Now getting more uneasy as the guy's closing the distance, he gets to his feet and loudly declares, "Hey man, can I help you with something or what?" And the guy's about 15 or 20 feet away from Marv now, standing at the edge of the clearing in the forest. The guy looking Marv dead in the eye speaks and says, "Help me." Marv said he was already starting to actually get worried at this point because he said the way the guy was and was saying things didn't seem normal. It didn't sound right. The guy, unmoved, still says, "Help me," again, but slightly more emphatic, but really just louder. Marv said that's when he picked up on what was truly wrong about the situation. He said the timbre of the voice was more female and actually sounded like a recording being played, and the guy's lip and mouth movements weren't actually matching up with the phrases. It was just like he was opening his mouth, emitting the phrase, and closing it again. Marv said, "What do you want help with?" Not daring to back up or move whatsoever. The guy standing still, motionless, then looks and says, "Help me," again, and repeats the phrase another 3 times, slowly but not louder in volume. Marv, now totally unsure of what was happening, interrupts the guy and says, "Hey, what do you actually need help with? Do you need my help or not?" He continues loud and firm in tone, and the guy actually doesn't miss a beat and says, "Help me," again, now taking a step towards Marvin's direction. Marv told me that he did not only think that this could be a terrible situation, but he had to do the only thing that made sense, and he drew his semi-auto 0.45 pistol, pointing it at the guy, telling him, "You need to get back. I don't care what you want." And the guy starts to get more animated and agitated, still repeating the phrase, but weirdly not taking a step away or closer now. Marv did what he thought was the right thing given his current predicament, assuming he was dealing with an unstable or potentially dangerous individual, and discharged a round into the ground in front of the guy. Now this is where it gets crazy. Now as the guy stops uttering the phrase, goes silent, still staring at Marv. Now, he then does a backflip or somersault kind of thing backwards into the woods and immediately out of sight. Now, I don't know what you're thinking because I still had the same reaction. This sounds like some rubbish, but Marv gave no indication of falsehood or laughing and told me the exact same thing each time in this dead serious demeanour. Yet Marv said the guy backflipped almost effortlessly, as though he was being pulled back by an unseen tension coil. He described it as completely humanly unnatural and totally out of place. The guy had just appeared and repeated the same phrase over and over again, becoming more and more frantic until Marv took a shot to the ground and he starts to flee/hit. Marv said he stood there, focused on the forest where the guy flipped into, and sees no further movement. It was almost like the guy had never been there. He stayed like this as the sun starts to set and the normal night sounds creep in. As I mentioned before, Marv is a pretty unshakable fellow and actually stayed in the area for the night/day before returning with no further incident. When he told me and some of my friends about this, of course we asked many questions. We asked him to elaborate and just explain the guy's speech sounds. He said the more he thought about it after the incident, the more sure he was that it was definitely a female's voice coming from the guy. And it was like he heard somebody say this and tried to mimic it like a parrot or bird would. It's almost like it's a law. He didn't give any indication to follow or utter anything else weirdly. He reacted immediately to the gunshot though, and you know what followed there. He has been back to the property a few times after and not really had any other strange occurrences happen to himself there. The only other minute detail that I can think of is that he did remember hearing the early morning of the first night what sounded like a gunshot off in the distance, eerily similar to his .45, thinking that he may have heard it again on the hike also on the way out. There are people that hunt in the area and it could have been one of them, but it was pretty weird. Since this incident, he did some online research in the area and found many legends/stories and supposed encounters with skinwalkers and things of that nature, not to mention mimics and other similar sounds apparently made by those creatures. A lot of his encounter lines up with these tales, but there's nothing terribly tangible to prove it, of course, but I don't know, it's pretty weird what happened. Now, my father and I were taking a quick hike a few miles north of Butte, Montana. It was not absolute wilderness, that far out of Butte, but a few miles outside of most towns in Montana, meaning you're way out in the backwoods. Now, it wasn't an unusual day by any means, just a warm summer afternoon, perfect for a little hike. We were only a mile or so away from where we parked when we saw a large trash bag along the trail. I hate litter bugs, especially in the woods. I intended to haul it back up and dispose of it correctly, and when I attempted to lift the bag though, it was heavy, which is much more than I anticipated it to be. Curiosity gets the better of my father and me, and we split the bag open to see what's inside. I think it's going to be a dead animal, but it's not totally unusual for someone to dispose of a dead dog or cat in a similar fashion in this part of the world. Some people out here will poach deers and leave trimmings like this too. Upon opening the bag, we see a boot, then sock, and then pants. We suddenly realise they're all attached to somebody's legs. It looks so unreal, like a movie prop, like somebody took it off and threw them in the bag, like a prank. How? It wasn't. I fell backwards and started having a panic attack. Nothing prepares you for something like that. My dad, on the other hand, sprung into action. He immediately closes up the bag as best he can, and then we start surveying the surroundings. That freaks me out more. Though my gasp comes out, I ask him, "What are you looking for?" And he said somebody could be watching us. Can you imagine stumbling upon a serial killer dump site and they're watching you? Didn't really help my panic. As I tried to calm down, my dad called the Silver Bow County Sheriff and reported what we found. Limp-legged, we hiked back a mile or so to the road and waited for the cops to show up. The authorities searched the area with their dogs and never found any other pieces or even a trail to follow. The sheriff's people even searched our truck and interviewed us to see if we've been responsible, but nothing ever comes out of the incident. It's been just over 10 years now, and nobody has any idea who these belong to. No missing person reports match up, and the DNA's never showed up on a database. Montana has a reputation for being a bit on the rough side, so it's not impossible this was a local who ran into trouble. But I don't know, it's just a crazy thing that happened. Okay, so I have no idea exactly what I saw that night. I've researched everywhere for sightings or even myths around what I saw in that area, but honestly, I haven't found anything. If anybody has any idea, just tell me. So, my friends and I go camping a lot, and our favourite place is Red River Gorge, Kentucky. We don't really go there too often, to be honest, but it was really nice whenever we actually went there, and we always had a good time there, and I still go. It's the closest place to where I live that you can go and see the Milky Way, which is pretty cool. It's perfect to stargaze, and I've seen a shooting star almost every clear night of which I've been there. When we go without our kid, we will night hike to a good lookout point and stargaze for hours. Now, for our first experience night hiking, we would go to trails we knew well, and were used to going there frequently during the day, ones with log fences and gazebo resting places. The most used trail is a trail in a natural bridge state park that leads up to the natural bridge. This trail is around 2 miles uphill depending on your starting point. I've done this trail every summer of my life and could do it blindfolded. It has wooden steps, carved rock steps, long handrails made out of wood, multiple sitting points under a roof, trash cans, but after reaching the main trailhead, it has no lights at all. It's often used while it's uphill, but the difficulty is low. As long as you have a good grip on your shoes and water, you'll be fine. My friends have done it with me multiple times and are confident in hiking as well. Hiking this trail at night is not allowed, but it's the woods, and I've never really been one to care about closing times for the literal outside. When we use the main trail to hike to the top, we will park in a parking lot designated for the pool and Hoedown Island. You walk across the road that leads to the pool, and you're at the first trail marker. You go up the gravel for a while and pass the Natural Bridge State Park Lodge. There's a waterfall and some lights, so it would be best to go fast and watch out for rangers that would tell us to leave. Then you have to walk across another road, and there's a mini shelter to sit in or a small rock wall to rest your legs upon. Then it's the beginning of the trail to the top. That night was weird to begin with. Now as we started the hike, the clouds took over and it appeared as though we'd been walking for nothing to even stargaze at. But we went anyway, just in case it cleared out by the time we got up there. In the beginning, it was just paranoia that was keeping us stressed, and quite it seemed. Now, you know when you've reached the bottom of the bridge when you see a giant wall of limestone? During this time, there was a gazebo that was set to the right of this wall, and the trail continued and followed next to the wall. Where you come from is a fairly steep part of the trail, and the gazebo is welcomed. My husband, my best friend at the time, and I all sit on the gazebo steps. The bench is under a roof and even darker than the rest of the outside, so we just stay on the steps, facing to where we are looking down the trail that follows the limestone wall. Each of us have a bright LED headlamp and a handheld flashlight. We don't usually look at each other when we hike at night because the lights are so bright it will blind you. So we sit in line like the Lord's Supper and walk in a line or staggered one so we don't blind ourselves. It's after hours at this point, so no ski lift rides had gone on for hours, and the rangers had already done their sweep and left right before we got out of the car and headed up. We left no time between them, making sure the trail and top were clear so we could start hiking up. The ski lift takes you up to the top, but there are other workers that stay and do counts and make sure it's clear. I guess I have to make these points because that's what I was thinking when what seemed to be out of nowhere, a girl with a headlamp begins to walk down the trail we're looking at. She's in a sundress and flip-flops. The hike is uphill, and while it is a fairly easy hike, there's no way to do it without real shoes really. You especially need water too. She'd have to hike up and down at this point without food or water. Her light was bright, and when she reaches where the trail turns from in front of the gazebo to down where she come from, she stopped. She just stood there completely still, almost looking like how we see anatomical drawings. She was looking directly at us, sitting there. Her light actually makes me bring my hand up to shield my eyes from the brightness. She didn't even turn away from the lights at all, or even seem bothered. She had 6 LED lights aimed directly at her face. I say hello, and she kind of just pauses. I say, "Hello, how are you?" And I then say, "Oh, what's wrong?" And hear, "Oh, I'm fine." She then just stood there still with her hands to her side, still staring at us. The light from her face made it impossible to see anything. And she just turned around and walks back down slowly to the part that she's come up from. She got to a part where the trail turned, and we saw her light just stay in that same spot for a minute. Then she turned around and slowly fades out of sight. We wait around for a while before continuing up. I kept making comments about how weird that was, and everybody else just said the same thing. But no one ever came after her. She had done this hike alone, I guess, but why at night? And somebody wouldn't be doing this without others knowing, and surely a ranger would find her. We got up after a bit and started back up to the top. It felt like much longer than it ever had been before, but as we made it to the top, there's stone steps named Fat Man Squeeze that you get to at the top of the bridge, and you can walk across it and whatever. Going up and being on top, you could hear twigs snapping, almost alternating from left and right. We lay down and try and stargaze, but the clouds are even thicker, and it was terribly hot. We heard voices at times, and my husband kept on saying that he was sure he heard something. Now, we saw a flashlight, but never saw anybody next to it. And then we heard a bird call, but it wasn't like a bird would make this kind of noise. It was almost like somebody imitating one, like rhythmic and not natural at all. I was convinced we weren't alone and hadn't been alone, but Also, I am the most easily spooked. Now, I asked to leave as soon as they're done, and they were ready right then and there, and that scares me, that they're afraid as I am at this point. We began going down the way we came, and it felt like it was taking too long. We were going steady and quick, and it was downhill, but we were not making any ground of it. It seems hard to explain, but it was so weird at that one point that I even said it aloud, saying, "This feels so long," and everybody agrees with me. I kept looking behind me with the flashlight, and my husband kept looking out to the side, so my friends kept hers mostly forward. I kept feeling like I was being watched and couldn't figure out what footsteps they are other than our own. It was weird. I would turn in one direction of a noise but not really see anything at all. When my husband was walking, he kept on saying that he was catching eyes with his flashlight. Usually you can catch raccoon eyes, but it was different and seems bigger, and he never got really to see exactly what this was, only seeing the eyes for a couple of seconds. Now we're hiking down a semi-flattish area compared to the downhill hike that we've been doing at least. The log fence or handrail, whatever it's called, is on our right side. We're basically in a row within walking distance of this barrier thing, and my husband suddenly stops and says, "What's that?" But the question is more like an alert. I move my headlight on in the direction that he's pointing and don't see anything. Then both of his lights catch a shape, and then my headlamp catches it as I move my hand away to the center. And I catch it too, and my friend simultaneously finds it with her light. All six of us shine our light onto this kind of reflective light grey creature. It is bent in a crouching position, kneeling on its right leg, and starts turning towards us. It starts to slowly stand and my mind is racing. It looks human but it's too big. People mistake human shapes for what's actually bears in the woods often, but this is skinny. It is thin and big and almost white, so it's light grey kind of and resembles almost a dolphin skin. There's a shine to it and our lights get a reflection over it. It gradually comes to a full standing position, and its head is long and its eyes are in a human position on its face, facing forwards. But I can't really see any facial features, just big old empty holes or pits where its eyes should be. It looks directly at us and our light. It stood there and was really intimidating, almost like when a snake raises up to show its height. It was like it was stepping up for a fight from crouching and then turning to us. Its arms hung down low and its hands are almost long, maybe by its knees. It stood around 9 feet or so and wasn't that far in front of us, and it hasn't really got hair at all. Its head was just large. I couldn't really process what I was seeing. Then I feel my husband hitting me on my back yelling, "Run, run, run." I start to understand that we have to get away from this thing, and it then suddenly pivots and runs to the right, going backwards on the trail so it could get around the barrier and run off the trail behind us. We take off running the rest of the way down the trail, knowing that this thing is not much further away and much quicker than we are. We didn't talk at all because we're all tired and really scared. We don't want to get caught. We keep running as far as we can, but eventually make it to an area that's not too steep. It never felt like we're out of sight of this creature. As we made it to the trail beginning with the gravel, we could hear something to the side crashing through the forest, and we ran until we get to the car, then driving as fast as we can, and as soon as we got to the main road, we can see the stars again. Now, when this thing looked at us, I knew it was smarter and probably stronger than us. I knew that if we hadn't have seen it, it probably would have done something horrible to us. Now when we make it back to where we were all staying, all of us took out our phones and wrote a note on what had happened. None of us spoke to each other until after we all wrote our things, and all of us saw the exact same thing. I still don't know what to make of it.